All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something a little personal, maybe a little bit awkward for some folks. We're going to be talking about faking orgasms.
Yeah.
Um, and we actually have some really fascinating new research to really get into this. It was just published last October in the Journal of Sex Research, 2024. And what's really kind of cool about this research is it specifically looks at why people stop faking. We've heard a lot about why people might start, but actually stopping is kind of an interesting new area of study.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really interesting question. And this study is really impressive. It surveyed over 11,500 adults.
Wow.
Across 6 European countries. So Denmark, Finland, France, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. And this was back in 2022, so pretty recent data.
Okay. Yeah.
And the large sample size, as I said, is really impressive. And it included a significant number of men, which is really important because a lot of the previous research has really focused on women's experiences. So this gives us a much more balanced view of the phenomenon.
That's super important. And so what are we going to do with all this data? I mean, what are we hoping to kind of discover in this deep dive?
Well, today we're going to look at the most important and maybe some surprising insights that came out of this study about faking orgasms.
Yeah.
We really want to understand this behavior because it is pretty common.
Yeah.
And how it's connected to satisfaction in our relationships and our well-being. So think of it as like your guide to really getting informed on a topic that people don't really talk about that much.
Yeah, exactly. And a little sneak peek, about 51% of those surveyed never faked. About 28% stopped faking, and 13% are currently faking.
Yeah, those are some pretty interesting numbers right off the bat. And we're going to delve into those reasons for stopping because they're actually really insightful and they could offer some valuable lessons for everyone.
Yeah, and maybe just thinking about your own experiences or the experiences of those around you, it'll give you a different perspective after we get through all this.
Definitely.
So let's start with just how prevalent faking is.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, about half, 51%, said they'd never faked an orgasm. But there's some really interesting differences when we look at gender.
Okay.
So about 66% of men said they'd never faked, compared to only 36% of women.
Wow, that's a really big difference.
Yeah.
So what about on the flip side?
Yeah, so when we look at those who have faked, more women, about 18%, are currently faking compared to 9% of men. And about 34% of women admitted to having faked in the past versus 19% of men. So we see these pretty consistent gender differences.
So it really does challenge some of those stereotypical assumptions, right?
Yeah.
That it's mostly women who are faking. I mean, it's clearly more common, but it's not exclusively a female behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And I think these gender patterns really speak to a lot of the issues around, sexual expectations and communication in relationships that we're going to get into a bit later.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, are there any other interesting patterns?
Yeah, another interesting thing the study found is that the prevalence of faking actually varied across the different countries.
Oh, really?
So, for example, France had a higher proportion of respondents who said they faked orgasms. And then on the other hand, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, they had a larger percentage saying that they'd never faked.
I wonder if that has something to do with, the different cultures in those different countries.
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. I mean, the researchers suggested that in the Nordic countries, which are generally seen as having a more liberal and open approach to sexuality, and they've got really good sex education programs, that could contribute to the lower rates of faking there.
Makes sense.
Because maybe there's less pressure to perform, or maybe people are just more comfortable being honest about their sexual needs in those cultures.
Yeah.
Whereas in France, societal norms might be a little bit different when it comes to sexual expression, potentially leading to more faking.
Okay, so we know how many are faking and where it might happen more. But let's get into the reasons why people stop. And this is really interesting because it hasn't been explored as much. So tell me about that.
Okay, so the top 3 reasons that people gave for stopping were actually pretty consistent across all 6 countries.
Oh, okay.
Which is really interesting. So the number one reason, given by about 28% of the people who used to fake, was that they'd become more comfortable not having an orgasm.
Okay.
And this was especially common in Finland.
So what does that mean?
I think it suggests a real shift in mindset. Maybe they've let go of that pressure to always have an orgasm.
Yeah.
Maybe they realize that it's okay not to climax every time.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's next on the list?
The second most common reason was that they started to communicate their preferences to their partners. About 27% said this.
Oh, that's great.
And this was particularly prevalent in Norway and the UK.
Okay.
So you can see that open communication plays a huge role here. If you can tell your partner what you like and what you don't like, you're less likely to feel the need to pretend.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that just makes sense. Like, you build that trust and that intimacy, and then the pressure kind of just comes off.
Yeah, exactly. And then the third reason, which about 24% of people mention, was that their partners started paying more attention to their needs and desires. And this was really notable in France, Norway, and the UK.
So it's not all about the individual, right? It's about how responsive the partner is as well.
Absolutely. When your partner is really tuned into you and trying to please you, you feel more comfortable being honest about what's working and what's not. And that can really change the whole dynamic.
So we've got being comfortable, communication, and an attentive partner. I mean, those are some pretty solid foundations for a healthy sex life.
Yeah, I think so.
So were there any differences in these reasons between men and women?
Yeah, there were actually some interesting gender differences in the reasons given. So, men, for instance, were more likely to say they stopped faking because they felt more confident, or kind of surprisingly, because they got caught. And then another reason for men was that they were no longer sexually active. Yeah. And I guess it'd be really interesting to know, like, what happens after you get caught? Like, how does that conversation go?
Yeah, right.
And what changes in the relationship after that?
That's a whole nother episode right there.
Yeah.
So what about the women?
So women were more likely to say that they stopped because, again, they became comfortable not having an orgasm.
Okay.
And they also chose that other, like, unspecified reason more often than men.
I wondered what those other reasons could be.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure without more information, but it suggests that there might be some unique factors at play for women that weren't specifically addressed in the survey.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now let's look at some of the factors associated with faking.
Hmm.
Who's more or less likely to have done this?
All right, so let's start with comparing those who have faked in the past with those who've never faked.
Okay.
So one of the biggest factors is, as we've seen, being a woman. That was associated with a higher likelihood of having faked. Also, having a medium or long education, compared to just a short one, was linked to past faking. And then sexual orientation also played a role. So identifying as asexual, bisexual, or homosexual, compared to heterosexual, was associated with a higher likelihood of having faked in the past. And then relationship status.
Yeah.
Being in a relationship but not living together was more likely to have led to faking in the past compared to those who were single and not dating.
Okay.
And then surprisingly, having children was also associated with a higher likelihood of having faked.
Really?
Yeah. And then having more lifetime sexual partners and a higher frequency of orgasm were also linked to a greater chance of having faked.
So more orgasms means more likely to fake.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't really make sense.
It seems counterintuitive at first, but the researchers suggested that maybe people who have orgasms more often might actually feel more pressure to keep up that level of, like, sexual success.
Oh.
So they might be more likely to fake it in situations where they don't actually climax.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. What about the factors that make someone less likely to have faked in the past?
So older age, first of all.
Okay.
And then being from those Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, or Sweden, was associated with a lower likelihood of past faking, which kind of backs up that idea that culture plays a role, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what about current faking? Are the same factors involved?
Yeah, there are some similarities, but there are also some interesting differences.
Okay.
So being a woman is still a factor, and identifying as homosexual compared to heterosexual was also linked to currently faking. And then having children and having more lifetime sexual partners, those stayed consistent as factors as well. But then when we look at countries, being from France or Norway was actually associated with a higher likelihood of currently faking.
Okay. So what makes someone less likely to be faking right now?
So older age again.
Yeah.
And then being in a relationship and living together compared to being single and not dating, that was linked to a lower likelihood of currently faking.
Oh.
And then also higher orgasm frequency and, interestingly, being from Finland or Norway.
So the living together thing, what do you think that means?
Well, it could mean that when you're living with your partner, there's just more intimacy, more comfort, and more open communication. And those things could all lead to less faking.
Makes sense. The study also looked at open relationships and the length of relationships.
Yeah, so they found that people in open relationships were more likely to have faked in the past and to be currently faking.
Oh.
And then, on the other hand, longer relationships were associated with a lower likelihood of both past and current faking.
So the longer you're with someone, the less likely you are to be faking.
That seems to be the pattern, yeah.
I wonder why open relationships would be associated with more faking.
Well, it could be that there are just different dynamics and expectations in open relationships. Maybe there's less pressure to have an orgasm with every partner, or maybe there's more communication about what's working and what's not.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to say here, we're not making any judgments about open relationships.
Exactly. We're just reporting what the study found.
Right. This whole section really is just about understanding the different factors that might influence whether or not someone fakes orgasms.
Yeah, and it challenges some of the assumptions we might have about who's doing and why.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to sex toys. Because the study actually had some interesting things to say about the connection between sex toy use and faking orgasms.
Yeah, they found that people who never faked orgasms were more likely to never have owned a sex toy.
Hmm.
And then those who had faked in the past or are currently faking were more likely to own them.
So maybe people who are faking are more likely to be exploring different avenues for pleasure.
That's one possibility. They might be trying to bridge that gap between what they're experiencing in partnered sex and what they know they can experience on their own.
Yeah, that's a good point. And did they find anything about people considering buying sex toys?
Yeah, they did. So, among those who didn't own sex toys, those who faked orgasms were more likely to have thought about buying one, which
Interesting.
again might suggest that they're looking for something more, something different in their sexual experiences.
Okay, so what about how people use sex toys? Was there anything about that?
Yeah, so people who faked orgasms were more likely to use sex toys alone,
Hmm.
while those who never faked or used to fake were more likely to use them with a partner.
So maybe for some people, sex toys are a way to kind of fill a void in their partnered sex lives.
Yeah, potentially. Or maybe they just prefer to explore their own sexuality independently.
Right, right. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's get to what's probably the most important part. Satisfaction.
Hmm.
How does faking orgasms relate to how satisfied people are with their sex lives, their relationships, and even their lives overall?
Yeah, this is really where we see the potential impact of this behavior. So the study found that people who are currently faking orgasms reported lower levels of sexual satisfaction
Okay.
compared to those who faked in the past. But there was no difference between those who had never faked and the other two groups.
Mhm.
So it's the act of currently faking, not just having faked in the past, that seems to be associated with lower sexual satisfaction.
Makes sense. So what about relationship satisfaction?
So, similar pattern there. People currently faking orgasms reported lower relationship satisfaction compared to both those who had never faked and those who had faked in the past.
Again, it's the active faking that seems to be the issue.
Exactly.
And what about life satisfaction in general?
This one's really interesting. The study found that current fakers reported lower life satisfaction overall compared to those who had faked in the past. But there was no difference between those who never faked and either of the other two groups.
So faking orgasms might actually be impacting people's overall happiness.
Yeah, I think that's what this research is suggesting. It seems like that lack of authenticity in your sex life can have a ripple effect into other areas of your life.
Wow. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that something like this could have such a big impact.
Yeah,
But I guess it makes sense when you think about how important intimacy and connection are to our well-being.
absolutely. And it's really important to remember, though, that these are just associations. We can't say for sure that faking orgasms directly causes lower satisfaction.
Right.
It could be that there are other factors involved.
Yeah, maybe there's something else going on in the relationship that's leading to both the faking and the dissatisfaction.
Exactly. But I think the connection is strong enough that it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, definitely. So after this deep dive into faking orgasms, what are the key takeaways that people should really remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that faking orgasms is really common, and it's something that people do for a variety of reasons. But the good news is that people can and do stop faking. And when they do, it's often because they've started to communicate more openly with their partners, and they've become more comfortable with themselves and their sexuality.
And I think it's really important to remember that connection we saw between faking and lower satisfaction, both in relationships and in life overall.
Absolutely. It really highlights how important it is to be authentic in our intimate lives.
Yeah. So here's something to think about. What would happen if we, as a society, started to talk more openly and honestly about sex.
Yeah.
What if we encourage people to express their needs and desires without fear as judgment?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that we all need to be thinking about.
Yeah, because if we can create a more accepting and open environment, maybe we can help people feel more comfortable being themselves in the bedroom,
Mhm.
and that could lead to more fulfilling and satisfying experiences for everyone involved.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into faking orgasms. I hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
Yeah, me too. It's been a really interesting conversation.
And if you're interested in learning more about sexual communication and satisfaction, there are tons of resources available online and in your community.
Yeah, don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help if you need it.
And remember, you're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely not.
Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.